Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks everyone who's been involved in the organisation. It's been a really interesting conference so far. Um, so, I'm going to be talking about affording imagination. To make sense of the claim that I want to make, forget about imagination for a second, and think about something else, which is the problem of action selection. So I'm in trouble with my slides. There we go. So the problem of action selection already came up in one of the talks earlier on today. So roughly the problem is this: at any given time, there's a huge range of actions that we can possibly perform. Just think of all the things you could do right now. So think about the position of a footballer. Someone passes the ball to Nikita Paris here. She has just all these different things that she might do and somehow has to pick the best action. Otherwise, there might be bad consequences for the team. Right? So here's how Prescott, Bryson, and Seth put it. Action selection is the task of resolving conflicts between competing behavioral alternatives, or more simply put, of deciding what to do next. So an awful lot of work in psychology and philosophy of action, you can kind of frame it in terms of this core question. How do we find a path through this space of possible actions? There are all these things that we can do. How do we pick one and do it? How do we pick generally the right thing, or at least something that's good enough? Okay, so how does this relate to imagination? Well, in a way, imagination presents us with an action selection problem as well. Think of all the different imaginative acts that you can perform right now. How on earth do you pick the right one? Right. So in the conference today and in all sorts of current literature, there's many and varied ideas about the different useful functions that imagination can perform. Right. But it can only perform those useful functions if we perform the right imaginative act at the right time. And the complication with imagination is this: the space of possible imaginative acts is vast, right? I said think about all the different physical things you could do right now. Now think about all the imaginary things you could do right now. It's just an absurdly large search space for your actions. So this is a problem of imaginative action selection. How do we know when to use our imagination? Right? There are good times and bad times to use your imagination. Right? If you should be concentrating on a conversation, it's not a good time to be imagining far out possibilities. Other times, imagination might be the thing that saves your life. You know, you have to imagine some clever way to escape a predator or something. But how do you know when it's a good time to imagine? And within that, once you do decide you're going to imagine something, how do you select which imaginative act to perform? So if I find an obstacle in my path, some imaginative acts are going to be more useful than others, right? Maybe by imagining climbing over it, I can find there is this feasible path over the obstacle. But if I imagine flying over the obstacle, then that's a waste of time that's probably going to end in my death or something. So my suggestion is this: perhaps our cognitive architecture deals with these two problems of action selection in much the same way. Okay, so in the case of how we select bodily actions, one of the things that's really important is our sensitivity to affordances. So put imagination aside for a second and think about affordances. So affordances are roughly opportunities for action. So, you know, a teapot affords gripping for me. So this is a concept, as I'm sure most of you all know, it comes from James Gibson, the ecological psychologist. When he first introduced the term, he described it like this: I mean simply what things furnish for good or ill. What they afford the observer, after all, depends on their properties. Now, one thing to note here is that most time we talk about affordances, it's to do with an object like the teapot, but it can apply to situations as well. So like the distribution of traffic affords crossing the road, right? So that's not an action you perform on something, it's just an action that's afforded in that situation. Now, the idea that there are such things as affordances, I don't think is especially dramatic. What's more dramatic is Gibson's claims that these interesting properties are properties that we can perceive. So he says this is a radical hypothesis, for it implies that the values and meanings of things in the environment can be directly perceived. So it's not that I see this teapot as red and as shiny and as being from God's own country. I actually see it as grippable. Okay, that's part of my perceptual experience. Now, there's another idea which I think moves quite a long way from Gibson, we don't need to get into that, but which is discussed in various different contexts today, which is that our perception of affordances can kind of draw actions out of us. So sometimes when I see a lovely teapot like that, it's not just that I see it as something that I could grip, I see it as something that I must grip. It's kind of tactile and attractive. As I walk past it, I kind of feel the urge to reach out and grip it. So affordance perception can have this kind of motivational force. And these are both things that help me in my day-to-day task of action selection. Okay, so that's affordances in the context of ordinary bodily actions. So here's my strategy for the talk. Perhaps this problem of imaginative action selection is solved or at least helped by the same kind of thing, affordance perception. So the idea is this: imaginative actions are drawn out of us by our perception of imaginative affordances. We see a certain kind of opportunity to imagine things in our environment, and that motivates or triggers a certain kind of imaginative action. And the way that we're attuned to our environment in that way helps us perform the right imaginative acts at the right times, thereby helps us with this really big problem of imaginative action selection. Okay, so to make sense of this proposal, I think the first thing we need to do is try and pin down what an imaginative affordance is. Right? So it's a very long way from the ordinary bodily affordances that are often discussed, like gripping, catching, eating, sitting on. Right? It's a very different kettle of fish. So I'd say something like this: the situation affords an imaginative act for a subject, if and only if it's possible for the subject to perform that imaginative act in that situation. Now, this is deliberately quite thin. Okay. So there are lots of different types of imagination. This has come up in discussion already. There's a distinction between two types, which I think is going to be important for me. I don't quite know what to call this. I think there might be some existing terminology for this, so maybe later on somebody could correct me. I'm going to make a distinction between intransitive and transitive imagining. So intransitive imagining would be something like this: imagining a centaur, right? So I can kind of close my eyes and picture this mythical beast. Now, this kind of intransitive imagining doesn't really rely on what's going on in my environment, right? Most of the time I can imagine a centaur. Maybe if I'm under like extreme stress, I'd just be unable to do it if somebody asked it, but most of the time I can do it. Now, there's a different type of imagining, which is transitive imagining, which is where you imagine of something that it is F, right? So you can imagine of me that I am a centaur, right? So that's quite different to closing your eyes and imagining a centaur. You look at me and imagine that I am a centaur, and that just off camera, there's like a back end of a horse just off the screen. Now, imagining of, that transitive imagining, might depend on your current situation a lot more, right? So, for example, if you weren't at this conference, it would be much harder to imagine of Tom McClelland that he is a centaur. Right? Imagining of me that I am a centaur might be based on your environment. That relates to stuff that's come up in discussion already. Okay, so that's imaginative affordances. Let me try and give you an example that might motivate the conclusion that we do indeed perceive these affordances and are sensitive to them. So here's an example I've used a couple of times before. Imagining you're trying to get over a series of stepping stones on a river, and then you come across a particular point in the sequence that's trickier than the others. And what you do is you pause and you mentally rehearse the act of jumping the gap. We already know from the first talk that that can be useful. And then because of that, you successfully perform the jump and then continue with some more easy steps. So my suggestion is this: when you're doing the easy steps, what you're doing is you're acting on the affordances in front of you. This stone affords a left-footed step. This one affords a right-footed step. This one affords a kind of sideways leap or whatever. And then when you get to the tricky stone, you're still acting on the affordance in front of you. But the affordance in front of you is different. This time it's an imaginative affordance. What this situation affords is pausing, rehearsing a bodily action in imagination, and then executing it. Okay, so I'm trying to suggest a kind of parity here, that insofar as it's plausible that the easy steps were based on a perception of affordances, we should say that the mental action that's performed at the difficult point is also based on a perception of affordances. but affordances of a different kind, imaginative affordances rather than bodily affordances. Okay, so here's a question. Why on earth would we perceive imaginative affordances? So one option, which I'm going to say is a bad option, spoiler alert, is this. The point of perceiving affordances for imagination is to tell us which imaginative acts are possible for us right now and which ones are impossible. So this would be a natural thing to say if we're going to draw our inspiration from the perception of bodily affordances. So Nikita Paris is playing football. She needs to know which actions are possible. There are some interceptions that are just impossible. You can't make them. There are some passes that are just impossible. If she can perceive which actions are possible and which ones aren't, that's really going to help narrow down her search space. So you might say, look, perceiving imaginative affordances is just like that. What you need to know is what imaginative acts are possible in your current environment, and that will dramatically narrow down the search space. Now, I don't think this is really going to work. And that's for the reason I've already mentioned a couple of slides ago, which is that many imaginative acts are unconstrained by what's actually going on in the environment around us. I can always imagine a centaur. So why on earth would I need to perceive in every single situation in my life that this is a situation in which I could imagine a centaur, should I wish? It doesn't narrow down the search space, right? I'm still going to be left with a preposterously large search space. And on top of that, a ridiculously large amount of content in my perceptual experience, right? I mean, I can't possibly perceive all the affordances of what I could imagine at any given time. Now, when it comes to that transitive imagining I was talking about, maybe it's a bit different, right? Now that you see me, there's this new opportunity. You can imagine of me that I am a centaur. You can imagine of me that I am a zombie and so on. It's still a ridiculously large search space. And also it's not really clear why that will be useful to always see these opportunities for transitive imagining. So that's not really going to help either. So what I'd like to encourage is option 2, which is that our perception of imaginative affordances is all to do with motivating optimal actions, motivating good, useful acts of imagination. So as I alluded to earlier, some of the bodily affordances that we perceive seem to invite us to act on them. So Nikita Paris has this useful thing where she can see which balls it's possible to intercept, which passes are possible, which shots on goal are possible. But as an expert footballer, it's more than that. She sees a set of possibilities, but she's drawn towards one of them over another. So she gets the ball and instantly she can see an opportunity to play a long ball or something. And she's drawn towards that possibility and it motivates her to act really quickly. And she couldn't even tell you why she did it, but it was exactly the right action for the situation and it results in a goal. The action is just drawn out of her. So when people talk about being in a state of flow, they often describe this experience of having actions drawn out of them by their environment. It's like you're not really doing it, you're just letting it happen. So here's how Susanna Siegel describes the experience. From your point of view, the environment pulls actions out of you directly, like a force moving a situation with your actions in it from one moment to the next. So why is that useful? Well, when I was looking at option 1, it was all to do with seeing what's possible. This is different. It's more to do with seeing what's best. So this kind of perception of invitations to act on affordances weights our options, right? So whereas before we were talking about a menu of possible actions, this is more like a set of recommendations on a menu. So you've got a menu of 10 dishes, but we'd recommend dish 1. That's what I'm thinking that the content of perception is like. It's pushing you towards one of the options over others. So what I'm thinking with imagination is something similar. So if we perceived these invitations to imagine, these cases where an act of imagination is kind of solicited, called out of us, that might achieve the same thing. It motivates us to perform an act of imagination that's apt given our current situation. And now we've got something that radically shrinks the search space, right? I've got all these different imaginative acts I can perform, but I'm zooming in on just one that's a good idea, right? So for example, in my stepping stone case, I'm in the middle of a river. There's a million things I can imagine, but I just see that this is a situation that just calls out for me to rehearse a particular leap in my mind. And I've done the right action and I can then crack on. So let me clarify a bit more about these two different functions. So I've been distinguishing between ordinary bodily affordances and imaginative affordances, and these two functions, discriminating possible from impossible actions and motivating better actions over worse actions. I don't really think that the perception of imaginative affordances has much to do with that discriminating possible from impossible, and a lot of bodily actions do. That's not necessarily true of all bodily actions. So imagine that somebody perceives singing affordances. Right? That doesn't look like it's going to have anything to do with discriminating between situations where it's possible to sing and situations where it's impossible to sing. It's more like seeing situations that lend themselves to singing, like, oh, this place has lovely acoustics or something. Similarly, it's not to do with what's imaginable as such. It's to do with what lends itself to particular imaginative actions. That's what I think we're tuned into. Now, one thing to note about these experiences of being invited or solicited to act, it's quite difficult to pin down exactly what the content is. And I don't have a good theory of this yet. Some people frame it quite normatively. So Nikita Paris sees it as good to pass the ball, or the person on the stepping stone sees it as good to imagine this. But I worry about putting that kind of content in perception. Other people go for a more imperative view. This is a bit more recent in the perception literature. The idea that as well as describing the world, perception contains imperatives. Do this, do that. So the perceptual experience is something like pass now or imagine now. There's something to that. I think there are some technical problems with it, but it's a nice idea. Another one which I'm a bit more keen on, and I'm co-writing a paper on at the moment, is that what you see is just that something's possible, but then there's this interesting non-perceptual experience of being readied to do it. So Nikita Paris sees all these possibilities, but one of the actions is automatically readied, and she kind of feels her leg moving towards playing a long ball. And it's that experience which constitutes the sense of being solicited to act on an affordance. Now, one thing I would say about this is that the underlying mechanism of feeling drawn to act on an affordance plausibly involves a kind of competition in the brain between different action signals. So here's a model put forward by Chiswick and Kolaska. You kind of perceive various affordances in your environment, all these action signals are initiated, and then they fight for further processing. And they get knocked out because of various factors, such as what your current task is, what your normal habits are, where your attention is directed, what the predicted reward is, how good an opportunity to perform that action it is. And then the winner of that competition gets performed, or at least the subject experiences a strong urge to perform that action. Now, this idea that things in your environment can trigger these action signals is very important. And I think that's going to be our way in to building a case in favor of imaginative affordances and our sensitivity to imaginative affordances. So I want to quickly note an influential study about our perception of bodily affordances, and I'm going to argue that actually there are similar findings regarding imagination. So here's the bodily affordance case from Tucker and Ellis. Participants were shown images of objects, and they had to specify whether the object was upright or inverted. And they did that by pushing a button. So they're shown an image of an upside down teapot, and if they think it's inverted, they have to push right-hand button. If they think it's the right way around, they have to push a left-hand button, or vice versa if it's a correctly oriented teapot. And what they found is that response time was faster when the handle direction on the teapot matched the required button. So this is an example of that kind of congruence here. I'm showing the teapot, the handle's on the left side, it affords a left-handed grip, and the button I need to push is the left-handed button. They also found that response time was impaired when the handle direction was opposite. So if I had to push a right button here, the handle being on the left seems to slow down my response time for some reason. And Tucker and Ellis interpreted it like this. When we perceive the teapot, we see it as affording a certain kind of grip, even though that's completely irrelevant to the task. And our doing so triggers the readying of a left-handed gripping response, something they called the potentiation of action. And because of that, that kind of interferes with our action of pushing the buttons. And it can interfere in a good way, as in the first case, or interfere in a bad way, as in the second. So here's a question for us. Are there interference effects that are plausibly triggered by imaginative affordances? If so, then we have a kind of parity, which really helps make the case for our being sensitive to imaginative affordances. Now, I don't think we need to devise new experiments to do this. I think what we need to do is reframe some existing experiments. So here's a really interesting experiment done by Samson et al. About a decade ago. Participants were shown images like this, where you have a room with some dots in and with a person in the middle. And they had to alternate between two different tasks. The first task was, how many dots are there? Okay, so if you look at the top image, the answer would be 3. And then the second task was, how many dots can the person see? So in that top one, the answer would be 2, not 3, because one of the dots is behind the avatar. Now, what they found is that in the trials where they had to say how many dots they could see, their response time was slower when the avatar could see a different amount of dots. So in the bottom case, it's fine. The avatar can see 2, I can see 2, no conflict. In the top case, the avatar can see 2, I can see 3, and that slows response down a bit. But here's the really interesting thing. They did the experiment where in all the trials, all they had to do was say how many dots they could see. They weren't asked at all what the avatar can see. And it was still slower in these cases where the avatar could see a different amount of dots, right? So the avatar's perspective is irrelevant to the task, and yet it's still interfering with performance. So here's my interpretation, that our perception of the avatar in the middle of the room affords a particular imaginative act. It affords imagining how things look from their perspective. And that potentiates an imagining of their perspective. And in cases like the top image, that then conflicts with the task that I'm performing, the task of saying how many dots I can see, because I'm already running this process of working out how many dots the avatar can see, even though it's irrelevant to the current task. Okay, so there's a lot more that could be said about this, but I hope that that parity is enough to motivate my hypothesis. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that's enough to prove that I'm right about our sensitivity to imaginative affordances. What can we do with that conclusion? What kind of work can we put it to? I want to quickly run through 3 potential applications. These are all quite embryonic, and I'd like to look at all of them in a lot more detail. So here's one. There's a rich literature on mind wandering, and Thomas Metzinger has this really interesting idea that mind wandering is to do with affordances for mental action, kind of buzzing around the mind and competing with each other. And then where your mind goes is determined by which of those mental actions wins in the affordance competition. So here's how he puts it. Could there be something like an exclusively internal affordance competition? Let me propose that mind wandering, the almost continuous appearance of task-unrelated thoughts, may be exactly this: the creation of a constant flow of possible mental actions, a dynamic inner environment constituted by non-sensory events which need to be predicted and controlled. Call this the cognitive affordance hypothesis. I'm very tempted to agree with Metzinger about this, but I think there's an interesting way of extending it. If you think about what happens when you mind wander, it's not always to do with what's in your head, right? It's not always to do with closing your eyes and letting your mind go. A lot of the time it's prompted by the environment around us. So imagine you're going for a casual walk through the woods. What you imagine is going to be prompted by what you see in the woods, right? It's exogenously driven. And that's something that Metzinger's account doesn't really make sense of. So I'm tempted to coin a label for this, which is that it's not so much mind wandering as world wandering. where you let your mind go off on various courses, but what course it goes off on is driven by stimuli in the environment. So I think we can explain that in the following way. You perceive imaginative affordances out there in the world, and different imaginative acts get readied. There's then a competition between those affordances, and the winner of the competition gets performed. Okay, so that's one application. Here's a second one. Affordances have a big role to play in skilled action. So skilled people are really good at action selection. And it looks like that's underwritten by them being really well attuned to the affordances around them. So going back to the football case, a skilled footballer is really good at seeing what's possible, and the best actions are kind of instinctively drawn out of them. I think we can say something similar for skilled imaginative actions. So imagination has a role to play in sport. So maybe a skilled footballer knows the right things to imagine at the right time. They just get these imaginative acts drawn out of them. A skilled rock climber, imagination plays a huge role in working out correct routes in rock climbing. So maybe there's an imaginative skill there that's underwritten by a kind of attunedness to imaginative affordances. Maybe a skilled business person imagines the right future possibilities or something. Maybe a skilled artist has similar attunement. Now that last one is worth building on a bit more. So that takes us to the third and final application of this hypothesis, which is that imaginative affordances are really important for art and our engagement with art. So it should be fairly uncontroversial that imagination has a big role to play in our engagement with art. So there's a lot of dispute in the literature at the moment about how big a role it plays, but even the skeptics agree that it has a pretty important role. So here's an example of something that requires imagination. So this is a recent production of A Midsummer Night's Dream in London. You can see people in the audience there, and they have to imagine that the man on the left has a donkey's head, and that the man on the right is a king of fairy, and that they love each other, right? Now that's an imaginative act that is kind of prescribed by what they're seeing on the stage. So Kendall Walton famously argues that really we can think of all artworks, including theatre, as props in games of make-believe, right? So all the people in the audience are make-believing that this thing is happening. And these actors are like props in that. So you imagine of the man on the left that he is bottom and that he has a donkey's head, and imagine of the man on the right, and so on. And you imagine of their conversation that it is a conversation between these fictional characters. Also, as has come up in the panel, Max and Sam say that our ability to imagine big departures from reality relies on external creative practices. So something that didn't come up so much in our discussion, Max says that linguistic cues are very important for imagining. Well, this is kind of continuous to that. It's not necessarily linguistic cues, but it's cues from artworks. These things out there trigger what we should imagine and what we shouldn't imagine. So if we see things that way, I think there's at least 4 explanatory applications for the concept of imaginative affordances. First, it helps us explain how artworks provoke particular imaginative acts, right? Why does what's going on the stage make me imagine a king of fairy and a donkey in this conversation and so on? Well, it's all to do with affordances. The audience imagines that the set in front of them in the theatre is the Forest of Arden, because they see the set as inviting the imaginative act of imagining that it's the Forest of Arden. I think this fits quite well with something Eduardo said earlier on in the discussion, by the way. I think it also helps with evaluating how well an artwork does in prompting certain imaginative acts. So this on the stage is a good set because it really lends itself to successfully imagining that it is a forest, whereas this really bad stage set doesn't lend itself to that imaginative act. So this idea of good and bad affordances comes up a lot in design theory. So the idea is, you can do the same thing on a PC as you can on a Mac, but the Mac has better affordances, something like that. It just lends itself to the actions more easily. I disagree with that, but people say. It's also useful for understanding cases of what's known as imaginative resistance. So sometimes you read a book and it invites you to imagine something, or you watch Terminator and it invites you to imagine a particular time travel scenario. When you think about it for a second, you think, well, I can't imagine that. It's impossible. There's a time travel paradox there. What are they playing at? And that's meant to be a bad thing in the artwork. And that's nicely reframed in terms of affordances. There's something about how the film's made that asks you to perform this imaginative act and you're sensitive to it. But then when you perform it, it doesn't work. So the artwork's kind of failed on its own terms. Fourth and finally, I think this helps capture the difference between novice and expert art consumers. So this goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about skill and how our skills shape our sensitivity to affordances. A novice looking at a painting or watching a play is going to perform one set of imaginative acts, and an expert is going to perform a different set of imaginative acts. And one way of framing the difference is like this. The expert is better attuned to the right, whatever that means, the right imaginative affordances. There's all these different imaginative affordances out there, and the expert's tuned into the right ones and the novice isn't. And that's why the expert's opinion might matter more than the novice's, because they're imagining the appropriate things for the appropriate time. I also think we might be able to extend this further for imaginative props that we use not in art, but in science. So there's a lot, as is mentioned in the brief of this conference, about the role of imagination in science. Think about the imaginative affordances offered by a really good model or a really good metaphor, something like that. That could be part of the picture as well. Okay, so I hope you agree, and that's all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.